This is one of the most interesting pieces of literature that I have ever read in my entire life, and we're gonna get into it. Hi guys, welcome to a video, and in today's video I'm going to be reviewing The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. Oh, this review has been a long time coming. Sounds like someone I once knew. She was great. So some background information for those of you who aren't familiar with this book. The Bell Jar is the only novel written by American poet and writer Sylvia Plath, originally published in 1963 under the pen name Victoria Lucas. The novel is semi-autobiographical with the names of people and places changed. Sylvia Plath actually committed suicide a month after its first United Kingdom publication. And the novel was only published under Plath's own name for the first time in 1967. The Bell Jar details the life of Esther Greenwood, a college student who is selected for a month-long summer internship as a guest editor of Ladies' Day magazine in New York City. However, she finds herself feeling disengaged, unfulfilled, and out of place. She then returns home to live with her mother, where her mental health deteriorates even further, and she attempts suicide. However, she is rescued from this attempt and then institutionalized, and we follow this journey with her. So what did I like about this book? I mean, I just don't even know where to begin. It was raw, it was poetic, it was perceptive. It's one of the most beautiful books I've ever read. You know, Plath has this way of kind of sucking you in and making you see the world through the perspective of her protagonist, yet at the same time, she presents her experiences of the world to you in such an unbiased way. You're free to make up your own mind about everything that unfolds in this novel. I love that Plath doesn't shy away from the kind of grittier aspects of life, you know? She doesn't sugarcoat anything, and she just says it how it is. I mean, what this book highlights is the way that it is absolutely absurd. I also like that Esther isn't this kind of perfect person. She's full of contradictions, complexities, and she's quite judgmental in a lot of ways. She doesn't always necessarily do the kind of right thing or make the right choices because she's flawed, but I found that incredibly kind of refreshing to read about, you know? Esther's journey with mental health is very vivid, and whilst everybody's experience with mental health is subjective, I do feel like this book is relatable to anybody who has really kind of felt disconnected from society, even if you haven't necessarily struggled with your mental health. If you've ever kind of questioned how you fit into society, I feel like this book is relatable. And The Bell Jar certainly makes people question the society that they live in. It does. And this isn't always comfortable to read about, you know, especially being a woman. But Plath is not interested in what makes people comfortable, and that is one of the reasons I just love her work so much. Whilst this book has a lot of merits, it should be noted that there are very obvious elements of racism in this book, which caught me off guard. I have to admit, it caught me off guard and stood out to me as problematic. However, the book is a product of its time, and that doesn't excuse the racism at all, but racist attitudes were casually absorbed and projected, especially back then, in the same way that homophobia and misogyny was and is casually absorbed and projected. You know, back then, society at large did not have an awareness of these problematic attitudes and their impact on minorities, and there was no real education to challenge it. I think it's safe to say that the landscape with social media especially has changed the conversations around racism and sexism and homophobia, but back then those conversations were less accessible, which is why you'll see a lot more problematic ways of thinking in older literature. So yes, I don't want anyone to feel like I'm excusing the racism in the novel. I'm absolutely not. But I also feel like it's important to kind of talk about it and not just kind of sweep it under the carpet, you know. If anybody is interested in reading about racism in 1950s America, I do highly recommend the book Zammy by Audre Lorde. Zammy is about Lorde's experiences growing up as a black lesbian in 1950s America. America, and it really exposes what life was like specifically for Black women, but also for Black queer women back in 1950s America. It tells a very different tale to the bell jar, and it's very interesting to compare something like the bell jar to Zammy. But anyway, back to the review. Personally, I have no dislikes for the bell jar at all. It's now one of my favorite books. What I will say, using a very kind of objective and critical eye, the writing in the bell jar is sometimes disjointed and the pacing isn't always smooth, and it is noticeable, but I don't really feel like it takes anything away from the novel. And I just feel like this book has touched a part of my soul, and I believe that's because Plath bared her own soul in this book. So, you know, really what stood out to me about this book and why I think this book has remained relevant throughout the years is its portrayal of mental health, its portrayal of womanhood, and its portrayal of female sexuality. Three subjects which have historically and still are to a degree very much kept in the dark. This book kind of pulls the covers back. You know, it's fascinating to look at how mental health was navigated back then compared to now. Things like shock therapy and insulin injections. And another thing about this book, which is so interesting regarding mental health, is how you can see the intersections between mental health and capitalism and mental health and womanhood. You know, in terms of womanhood, it's troubling to see how little the landscape has changed for women in terms of things like sexual assault and internalizing those experiences. And again, this is also connected to women's mental health. However, after reading this novel, one thing that I do feel has changed is the expectation on women to be married and to enter motherhood. One thing that I've noticed recently is with both straight and gay women, there's these new kind of conversations happening around kind of maternal expectation and marriage, which is a hugely positive change. And things like legal access to birth control that is commonly available now means that women aren't as stunted in their sexuality in the way that they were. Not something that applies to me as a lesbian. And speaking of lesbians, there is a lot to unpack where lesbianism and female sexuality is concerned in the bell jar, so much so that I am making a separate video about it. There's just too much to discuss for this review video. What I will say about the lesbianism in the bell jar is this. Although there's a clear level of ignorance around homosexuality in this novel, I'm not really of the opinion that the novel was homophobic. I'm more of the opinion that Esther was dealing with internalized homophobia and was in fact trying to bury her own lesbianism or queerness. And I have my reasons for thinking that. I definitely have things to back that up, but I will be discussing that in the separate video. And of course, since this book is semi-autobiographical, it does open up some questions about Sylvia Plath herself, but we'll leave it at that. We will. Overall, The Bell Jar is an incredibly important contribution to literature and lays bare the landscape for women in 1950s America. Plath encapsulates the gender expectations placed on women and lays it out in a way where people can see just how absurd these expectations are. I don't know if ethereal is the correct word to really describe the bell jar. It just has something very much otherworldly about it, almost like it has a spark of magic. There's just really nothing else like it, you know? Okay guys, if you've read this book, let me know your thoughts. I am a huge Sylvia Plath nerd, so, you know, we can get into it if you want. Don't forget to subscribe for instant disappointment, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye!